Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Ahmed, and this summer I've been working with Gerard O'Leary on the MUNIT project. So MUNIT stands for Microelectrode Neural Interface Testbed, and it's a device that sits on top of nervous tissue in order to record action potentials and send stimulus signals back to neurons. The device is intended to help neuroscience researchers study how neuron populations behave through this closed-loop system of recording and stimulating. And typically for these types of closed-loop experiments, there's a very hard latency constraint on the order of milliseconds between the time of recording an action potential and sending a stimulus back. So for every microelectrode on this device typically sits around dozens of neurons, which means that the signal this electrode would pick up would look something very similar to what you see in figure 1b, where you have multiple spikes and each one generally can come from a different cell. And therefore, a very important challenge that arises is that of spike classification, the ability to group similar spikes into the same class, where each class corresponds to a single neuron. Now, there are a lot of accurate spike classification algorithms out there, but the main problem with them is that they're mostly offline, meaning that you would have to finish your entire recording and then send that data over to an external PC where you would do the classification there. And this obviously doesn't meet the latency constraint that we have. Furthermore, many of the real-time solutions explored in the literature typically focus on reducing hardware resources, which more than often compromises their accuracy. And therefore, the goal with this project was to see how effective it would be to have a machine learning-based spike classifier, extrapolate patterns from these really accurate offline software algorithms, and apply them in real time for real-time classification. So in section 3, you see how this classifier would work in practice. The first step is offline training, where we would take 2 minutes of recordings and send them to the offline algorithm so that it generates where the spikes occurred, and it would assign a spike class to each one of these action potentials. With this, we have a labeled data set that we can use to train our classifier. So we're training an AdaBoost classifier, which is essentially a huge collection of these little decision-making trees. A single decision-making tree is a terrible classifier on its own, but when you have 2,000 of them, you can get very good accuracy levels. So after the training is done, this model is uploaded onto the device, where we start the real-time processing loop in figure 2b. So the first 2 steps are to apply an amplitude threshold to detect the spikes, and then extract them from the signal, making sure they're aligned at the minimum. The next step would be to split the spike waveform into a positive and a negative half, where each half passes through a series of what we call exponentially decaying memory banks, or EDM banks for short. Essentially, an EDM bank, all it does is it's an accumulator. It sums up all the samples of a signal, making previous samples decay at an exponential rate. By having different decay rates, we can capture different temporal features of the spike waveform. And the end result is, instead of storing 60 samples for the spike waveform, we can have an equivalent representation with only 6 EDM values. So this forms our feature vector for the spike that we pass to the classifier, and the end result is we get a label that assigns a class to the spike. So to validate this classifier idea, we had to check 3 important metrics. First, we validated the classification accuracy of the classifier by making a software benchmark in Python. We trained it on a data set that has 4 electrode channels and 10 spike classes, which meant we used the ground truth of this data set, which meant we didn't have to run the offline algorithm. And this is a good sanity check to see how good the classifier is without any inaccuracies carrying over from the offline algorithm. The training accuracy we got was 95%, which compared to other methods we reviewed in the literature is better than most. Next important metric was to see how many resources this classifier would use when implemented on an FPGA, a programmable circuit board. In figure 3b, you see how many resources were used for the 4-channel setup. And in all categories, we never exceed 10%, which is very promising. And the main reason for this low resource usage is from the simplicity of the AdaBoost classifier. The AdaBoost classifier operates on very simple comparison operations, which are very resource efficient to implement in hardware. And then finally, the most important metric to verify is the latency. Most of the latency came from the classifier, with some extra latency cycles from the spike detection module and calculating the EDM values. But when running this on an FPGA at a 10 megahertz clock frequency, the latency is 0.24 milliseconds, which leaves more than enough time for any further processing up until the simulation stage. So in conclusion, after all of this discussion, the gist that I'm trying to deliver is that this new classifier has some promising potential in performing both accurate and real-time processing. Through this AdaBoost classifier, we can extend patterns from good accurate offline algorithms and apply them in real time with low latency. The next step would be to train this classifier using the output of an offline algorithm to see how the inaccuracies would carry over, which is something that we're expecting. And the last step would be to extend this or to scale this solution to 60 channels to support the full MUnit system. So to conclude with a big picture view, this is a small exploration that would hopefully help build better neural interfaces that can hopefully someday tell us what conscious reality really is. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new and interesting about neurotechnology.
Thank you, Ahmed, for your presentation. Judges, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute your mic and ask.
Yeah, could I ask the first again?
Oh, go ahead.
So, Ahmed, this is very cool. You are using artificial intelligence and machine learning. I wonder what is practice in the past for this type of work without using artificial intelligence, machine learning?
Yes, this is a very good question. So most algorithms or previous algorithms, the way they would do it is they would do something called clustering, where they would, so I've talked about exponentially decaying memory banks, which is basically a way of encoding features. And then what would happen is they would use clustering algorithms to see how close the features from different neurons are to each other, and they would form groups using these algorithms. But the new approach in the project that I'm doing this summer was to see how a decision tree classifier would perform against these old methods.
So you think the advantage will be in terms of accuracy of a prediction or classification?
The main advantage is that it would extend. So the main problem was that the really accurate algorithms are software algorithms that are run offline, and when you try to move that to hardware, you normally lose you lose a lot of accuracy. So the main motivation was to see how we can sort of extrapolate those patterns from the good software algorithms onto the hardware.
I don't understand why move it to new hardware where you will lose accuracy.
So the software algorithms, they run on external PCs, and normally transferring the data takes up a lot of time. And we have a very small latency constraint that's on the order of milliseconds. And this is why we're trying to move it to hardware.
Okay, thank you.
So Ahmed, thank you for your presentation. That was wonderful. I was wondering whether you considered any, or are you aware of any bias in your data sets that you use for training?
Yes, absolutely. So as I've mentioned, we trained the classifier on what we call ground truth labels of the data set. So essentially, we were given where the spikes what the spikes are, and we were given labels to each spike. So we didn't actually run the offline algorithm yet. And that's what I meant by when we run the offline algorithm, we are expecting some reduction in the accuracy because the inaccuracies in that offline algorithm would carry over to the classifier.
Thank you.